Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Education Commission of the States webinar series, ECS Live. We're excited about today's topic, recruiting and retaining the next generation of teachers. For those of you that have not had the opportunity to meet yet, I'm Lauren Pasach, a senior policy analyst here at ECS, and it's so nice to be here with you today. I'll be your MC for today's event. For anyone new to ECS, Education Commission of the States was founded through the Interstate Compact for Education with the purpose of being a nonpartisan, not advocacy mechanism for state leaders to learn from one another, a role that remains as vital today as it was during our creation 60 years ago. On behalf of ECS's entire team, I'd like to thank our partners who make events like this one possible. Thank you for your continued partnership and support that allows for us to convene the people behind the policy. The topic we're going to explore today is recruiting and retaining the next generation of teachers. But before we get into the content, we wanted to take a minute to shout out teachers because this week is Teacher Appreciation Week. We selected the topic of today's webinar to focus attention on the next generation of teachers. But before we begin, let me extend a heartfelt thank you to all teachers and educators across the country. I myself am a former teacher, so I know firsthand the demands of your work, and I can't thank you enough for all that you do. We encourage our audience members, if you haven't already, to thank a teacher in your community this week. Before we dive in, I wanted to quickly flag that at the end of the webinar, we'll be sharing a short post-session survey and holding a few minutes for you to complete it live. As part of our commitment to continuous improvement and evidence-driven decision-making, ECS is partnering with the Wasatch Education Group, an education research and evaluation consultancy, to understand how this webinar series is meeting our intended outcomes and our audience's needs. Is also designed to be an interactive conversation. We will use a poll to gather your insights during the panel, and we will be glad to answer your questions. Please use the Q&A function to submit your questions as we go along, and we'll leave time to answer them at the end. At ECS, we are routinely in touch with state leaders about their efforts related to supporting elements of the educator pipeline. It's consistently one of the top priorities of state education policy leaders year over year. In those conversations, we emphasize that the teacher workforce is not a monolith. Shortages tend to be concentrated in specific subjects in schools, and what might recruit and retain one teacher might not appeal to another. Today's focus is on Generation Z and what it will take from a policy perspective to attract them into the profession and to retain them as they work and grow into their careers as teachers. It's our pleasure to introduce the talented group of education leaders joining us today. First, we're glad to feature leading research by our partners at the Southern Regional Education Board. Today, we'll hear a summary of that research from SRAB research analyst Shaniqua Pierce. Following Shaniqua's presentation, we'll hear from three panelists who will share their reflections on the factors influencing recruitment and retention of the next generation of educators. Those panelists are Caroline Gilbert, a music educator from Woodstock, Georgia, Delegate Joe Vogel, who represents District 17 from the state of Maryland, and Dr. Lennon Aldrain, the head of innovation and policy initiatives for the Next Education Workforce Initiative at Arizona State University's Mary Lou Fulton College of Teaching and Learning Innovation. And with that, it's my pleasure to pass it to Shaniqua. Shaniqua, take it away.
Thank you, Lauren. Next slide, please. Let's start with a quick grounding. When we say Generation Z, we're referring to individuals born between 1996 and 2012. So that means in 2025, the youngest among Gen Z was 13 and the eldest was 29. We know that Gen Z is a generation that grew up with smartphones, social media, and during a pandemic that reshaped how they view work, purpose, and stability. We focus specifically on Gen Z early career teachers, those with 5 years of experience or less, because this is a critical window. Research consistently tells us that the first few years are make or break for teachers. So, why did we decide to undertake this research? We needed to understand what's actually happening. Our goal in this research was to better understand the factors that contribute to Gen Z's interest in the teaching profession and the factors that contribute to their attrition. These are two sides of the same coin, and we can't address one without the other. In partnership with Vanderbilt University, our studies utilize a mixed methods design. On the quantitative side, we drew from state and survey administrative data from Tennessee and Kentucky. And from the qualitative end, SREB conducted in-depth interviews with over 50 Gen Z teachers across 8 states in our 2023 and 2026 studies. I have four main findings that I would like to dive into. Next slide, please. First, how Generation Z is different from previous generations and what's drawing Gen Z into teaching. We know that Gen Z is a more racially and ethnically diverse generation. Many of them come from low income backgrounds. They are also of the tech generation and seek more mental health supports. This generation desires flexibility, work life balance, career advancement, career support, and financial stability. We know that teaching is a service-oriented career, and many Gen Zers are motivated by careers of purpose. The Gen Z teachers interviewed as a part of these studies cited things like being able to help students and serve their communities as factors that ultimately drew them into the profession. Next slide, please. However, these interests aren't always present in the traditional teaching environments, and unfortunately, we've seen a severe decline in interest in teaching among Gen Z across the Southeast for over a decade. Next slide, please. Lower interest has compounded with other issues. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, the teaching landscape was already oversaturated by teacher shortages and turnover. During the last 6 years, teacher vacancies have reached all-time highs, while morale has reached an all-time low. While some states are making improvements overall in the South, the data has not improved to those pre-pandemic levels. Furthermore, student learning in the southern states still tends to lag behind the national averages. Next slide, please. Second, what's pushing Gen Z out early? Our research with Vanderbilt confirmed what other research has also shown. There are certain conditions that increase the risk of losing early career teachers. This includes inadequate prep from any preparation pathway, but the data did confirm that turnover is higher among non-traditional pathways overall. Teaching in what's known as hard to staff schools, and even secondary schools, as well as low salaries. Next slide, please. While teaching is often viewed as a stable career, it is also one that is extremely underfunded and undervalued. Our interviewees in our 2025 study of early career teachers talked about overwhelm, burnout, and a lack of support from leaders, mentors, and even families as major factors. Gen Z teachers specifically cited certain structures and other factors that push them to change schools or to leave in a few years. Some of this included low pay that isn't sustainable to support the individual or a growing family, toxic work environments that promote isolation, and not enough support to master the job and be successful. Next slide, please. This leads to my third point. The conditions that actually influence whether Gen Z will stay. We know that Gen Z teachers are purpose driven. They came into the profession because they believe that education has the power to change lives. Leadership matters very deeply to Gen Z teachers. They want leaders who are present, supportive, and invested in their growth. And they want mentors that can guide them through some of those challenging moments in the first few years of their career. Gen Z, they thrive in collaborative cultures where they feel like they have a voice in decision making. And they also value professional autonomy and having opportunities for advancement, ongoing learning, and leadership development that will keep them invested and engaged for the long term. Next slide, please. Our longitudinal Gen Z study further reveals that Gen Z teachers have mixed perspectives on artificial intelligence. While many leverage AI to streamline lesson planning and administrative tasks like crafting emails, others raise concerns about data confidentiality and ethical issues, including the environmental impact of utilizing AI. They also raise concerns about learning impacts. We've seen from other recent studies that Gen Z is the first generation to be negatively impacted by heightened tech use. A shared conviction emerged in this research. Gen Z teachers believe that students must learn to use AI tools thoughtfully and strategically as a complement to their critical thinking skills and not a replacement. Next slide, please. And finally, what this means for policy. District and state policies that focus on increasing supportive school environments can reap benefits for the satisfaction and the retention of their staff. This can also lead to attracting more teachers into the profession in these schools with that positive reputation. And supportive environments for the adults in the building leads to more support and growth for the students. And in turn, we know economic gains for the community. Next slide, please. Strong preparation, support, positive environments, and conditions along with advancement opportunities together can lead to this systemic change that we need to see. This is work that SREB has been doing for years to help states and districts with a blueprint for sustaining the educator workforce that can better attract, support, and retain more Gen Z teachers, as well as quality teachers across any generation. Next slide, please. SRB has several papers to support these findings and policy guidance for leaders. We have the 3 studies conducted with Vanderbilt University researchers, and we have 3 new policy reports: how to attract and retain Gen Z teachers, educator support systems for teachers and leaders, and our forthcoming report, a state policy guide for innovative, high impact school staffing systems. Next slide, please. And we also have our 16 state data collections on the P12 educator workforce labor market and compensation package data. Those links to those resources will be dropped in the chat for you all. Next slide, please. And as I conclude, one thing that I would like for everyone to remember after this presentation is that if Generation Z does not receive the support to be successful in their job, while also maintaining a sense of balance and stability in their lives, they will leave for another option that does. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your research and your summary of it, Shaniqua. As we transition to the panel, we want to highlight a resource to help understand the current landscape of state policies related to teacher recruitment and retention more broadly. That's ECS's 50-state comparison on teacher recruitment and retention. This resource doesn't specifically speak to Gen Z teachers, but it does highlight state efforts in all of the areas that Shaniqua mentioned, including state policies related to growing interest in the profession, teacher induction and mentoring, compensation, and more. And with that, I'm excited to bring in our panelists. We will start with Caroline Gilbert, who's a music director and assistant band director from in Woodstock, Georgia. What surprised you most as you entered the teaching profession?
When I came into the teaching profession, I'm in my fourth year teaching right now. I started 2 years in middle school. I've been in high school for 2 years now. What surprised me most was I knew what I needed to learn as I was walking into the field. And what I found was a lot of administrators and mentor teachers that were assigned or instructional leads. Um, they there was not as much of a collaboration as I was hoping or expected because I knew what I needed to learn going into the field. I knew there were some areas that my degree might have left a hole or two. I mean, I'm a music educator. There's a lot of administrative stuff that I'm still learning. But I would go to administration and I would ask for what I needed to do, and I'd be met with either no solutions or why don't you already know how to do this? And that's not what I expected from the teachers that I knew, and the educators that I got to experience when I was a student. So it was interesting seeing the difference between what an educator versus, what higher up staff can be, and the fact that I walked into this to continue learning, and not everybody was on board. So that was probably the biggest shock to the start of my career.
Thanks so much for sharing that with us. Um, Lennon, you've worked as a teacher and now you're the head of and an educational researcher at the head of innovation and policy initiatives for the next educational workforce initiative at Arizona State University. From what you've heard so far, what aligns with your experience and your research, and are there any observations you would add for us?
Sure. What struck me is that I'm a Gen Z researcher, so I'm 26, and so I think a lot about this as I guess a former Gen Z K-12 educator, now like a faculty member at a college of education, and I served as the former national president of Educators Rising back when I had just graduated from high school. Also formerly known as Future Teachers of America, Future Educators Association. And so what I think about all of those programs that we have for future educators, in particular, I was able to actually teach later on in my teaching career, before I entered higher ed, this class for future educators in career and technical education. Out here, it's called Education Professions. And basically, all the things that I had heard over my time teaching that course, I'm really interested in becoming a teacher. And yet, like, the pay is too low. And yet, I just like the job is so isolating, are things that students would say to me on a daily basis, rather anecdotally, of course, right? Because I wasn't systematically collecting data on those students, but it's great to have now kind of a treasure trove of knowledge around this particular generation of teachers. The other is that once I did get into higher education, I was incredibly interested in these high school teacher academy programs, these future teacher programs. And at the time, the students in the program were Gen Z. And so we were able to survey around 200 of them in a local school district, and found, again, similar findings to SREB. That paper is forthcoming. But really, the largest factor that influenced high school students' motivations to becoming educators was intrinsic motivation. But a lot of the mediating factors were not only things like, the pay is low, but more so a question about access to higher education, which I think is really interesting. When we think about the teacher pipeline, we are often thinking about, like, what are all the ways that we can expose students to the profession, get them to learn how to lesson plan, how to do all of these interesting things in instructional technology. And yet the actual barrier from getting Gen Z high school students who are in this future teachers class to their credential had nothing to do with their exposure or their desire to be a teacher, and more to do with the structural features of access to higher education. And so as I'm thinking about these findings, in particular recruiting Gen Z teachers, and I know later I'll talk about retaining them, I actually think one of the biggest structural features that we have to address is not only interest in the teaching profession. I think we have plenty of interest in the profession, but really the structural barrier of getting students moved from their coursework into a credentialing program, which for the most part, regardless of them doing a teacher prep program or doing something else and then getting an alt cert later, requires them to have access to higher education, which is a different question I think that we need to be talking more about.
Thank you so much for sharing those insights with us. And we'll look forward to seeing that paper when it's published. Next, we'll hear from Delegate Vogel from Maryland 17th District. Delegate Vogel, hearing all this research and perspective from Gen Z educators and about Gen Z educators, where would you say that you don't see policy keeping up?
So if I can, I'll start with where we are seeing policy keeping up. Maryland has made significant progress in addressing our educator shortage over the last few years. We've driven down our number of educator vacancies by 58%. We're under 900 vacancies statewide now. When I was first elected, that was over 1,600. There are two main legislative packages that have been put forward over recent years that I think have contributed to that. First is the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, which raised educator pay, it put forward this policy of collaborative time, which we're still now making sure is implemented in the proper ways, which reduces the amount of classroom time and increases the amount of time for collaboration between educators for preparing for lesson planning, et cetera. We also had another bill that we passed my first year in the General Assembly, which was a bill specifically to address the educator workforce shortage. I believe it was called the Educator Shortage Act. And that bill did a number of things. And building off of what Lennon was just sharing, it specifically invested in our student teachers, creating these scholarships. I believe it's $20,000 scholarships to help those who would otherwise be going through unpaid internships to be able to afford to go through the process and then be able to take the tests to become a certified teacher. So the point being, I think there are a number of policies that have been very successful in Maryland, and I hope Maryland can be really this case study for policies that help us address this issue of educator or this educator shortage issue, particularly when it comes to this generation, Gen Z. As a young legislator myself, I hear from younger educators across the state. I think one thing to point out here is that if you look at the remaining vacancies in our state and where the shortages are, they're not necessarily in classroom teachers, although there are some vacancies for specific subjects. But there's also a significant number of vacancies when it comes to our educator support professionals, our ESPs, whether that be speech pathologists, ESOL teachers, special educators. So that is something that I know we've been working on in the legislature to try to address, to put forward policies that make to ensure that we're paying our ESPs fair wages. I had a bill this session that we passed into law to incentivize the construction of educator workforce housing in the state, to specifically support those early stage teachers. So I want to see us in the future, in the years to come, be more intentional about how we help recruit those ESPs. Often they are the Gen Z educators that reach out to me, sharing the greatest concern.
Thanks for sharing with us everything that's going on in Maryland and all your great work and progress. Next, we'd love to bring in the audience. So earlier, Shaniqua offered 4 policy solutions to support the next generation of teachers. Um, and so from your state or from your work and your position, what area do you think is most aligned with the realities of younger teachers? So if you could use this poll to rank them in order of most aligned to least aligned. And we have here systems of support. So that includes preparation, induction and mentoring, advancement, collaborative and innovative strategic staffing models, compensation that reflects roles, not just tenure, and then finally, positive culture and workplace conditions. We're going to give you a minute to fill out this poll. We're at just about 50% have taken the poll. So if you want to participate, we'll give you about 10, 15 more seconds. So what's interesting that it's really spread out amongst the different categories, but it's interesting. Compensation does seem to be in the lead as being most misaligned, which does align with some research that we've seen among other categories of teachers, not just Gen Z. So that's an interesting finding here. Um, and we'll head back to our panel now and ask a couple more questions. So Lennon, your work at ASU, it focuses on strategic staffing models. How specifically do you see those programs impacting younger educators?
Sure. So, in the strategic school staffing model, as defined by not only us at Arizona State University and Friends at Opportunity Culture, but now also in the Federal Register and a priority of the current U.S. Department of Education, a strategic school staffing model replaces the legacy one teacher, one classroom model of school that we have had for decades upon decades here in the States and across the globe, and replaces it with this idea of a team-based approach to school staffing. So think of multiple educators who are not just responsible for their 25, their 25, their 25, their 25 in isolation, but actually a team of people wrapping around all 100 of those students and providing teaching and learning experiences to all 100 of those students. So to start, I think it's just helpful to set that in contrast, right? Multiple educators who share the same roster of students, who share them theoretically and most ideally during the same instructional blocks of time. Whereas in a one teacher, one classroom model, you're in a classroom all day long, very little contact with other educators. You don't know those who what other students of those other educators really have. And so in a strategic staffing model, we were trying to create smaller learning communities in high school and larger learning communities in elementary school. So to start, if I'm thinking about some of these pieces of preparation, of positive workplace culture, of what we heard in our research earlier in the presentation around isolation, the job of a teacher is very isolating. If you're a third grade teacher, you might not see another third grade teacher or even another teacher except for in the hallway on your way to specials, maybe at lunch before or after school. No one is accountable for the same outcomes that you are for that group of learners. It might even be that you're a first year teacher. You might be 21, 22, teaching third grade and expected to teach them just as well how to read as the person next door to you who's been doing it for 25 years. And the reality is that we can't and shouldn't expect our first year teachers to do that. But in a team-based approach, you could actually develop a just right set of roles and responsibilities. You could actually group kids between classrooms to give the learners that maybe need a little bit more support to the more veteran educator, the just right learners who could use the expertise of that first year Gen Z educator in the room. Right, the possibilities are more dynamic in some of these models. I heard, Caroline earlier was talking about teacher mentoring and induction. And I remember my first year teaching in a large school district out here in Arizona. And I had a district mentor who would come in once a month for 30 minutes at a time and would try to coach me as much as she possibly could. And I remember one time in March, she came in and told me that some girls, she whispered in my ear, there were some girls who were chatting in the back of the room. Have you tried proximity with them to get them to stop talking? And I said, yes, I've tried proximity with them. You come in absent of all this context of who those learners are, what they need, and yet you're trying to give me instructional advice. Like, yes, I've tried standing next to them. In a team-based approach where you have multiple educators sharing the same roster of students, the kinds of feedback loops, the instructional coaching that you might get isn't just, right, let me just flip open Harry Wong or I Teach Like a Champion or whatever you're using and pick a strategy and have you apply it. When you actually share the roster of kids, you can actually think about the strategies that matter and would work best for those groups of learners because you all share the same mental models of learners. So I think about that particular moment, Caroline, when you're talking about mentoring and induction supports and how it incredibly hard to do well in a one teacher, one classroom model. You're essentially, right, multiplying, trying to multiply the effects of your impact as an instructional coach and trying to increase instructional effectiveness across the board, so that we can create this ideal, most average classroom. But no educator is average, neither is a learner. But the other piece of this, I think, also, is just the scale of improvement. And I was talking with an instructional coach in the school district the other day who is coaching in one of these team-based models, who said, my practice has really changed in a team-based model. I don't go and try to meet with every single classroom now, trying to give them, even if I spent all 180 days a year doing that, and I have another counterpart, right? There are 200 teachers, that's 100 to 1 ratio. We would just never be able to give people that kind of feedback. But when we work and coach at the level of a team and in a strategic school staffing model, we might actually be able to reach the scale of instructional improvement that we want because we can coach a team around a set of instructional strategies. And so when I think about younger educators entering the profession, around not wanting isolated conditions, wanting more context specific feedback, wanting the ability to really game plan with someone else who also knows their learners, I think strategic school staffing models might be an incredibly attractive way to think about how we staff our schools, especially for Gen Z teachers.
Thanks so much for sharing that with us, Lynn. And we're really excited to see where strategic staffing models go. It's really interesting to hear about your work. Delegate Vogel, um, just wondering, you spoke about your recent wins in Maryland, and it was really exciting to hear about that. Are there other areas that you're seeing encouraging momentum? And are you seeing any issues, or what are you anticipating trying to address next on the horizon?
Ooh, that is a big question. We just wrapped up our legislative session a few weeks ago now, and this time for me and for many of my colleagues, I know Delegate Ebersol, who chairs our education subcommittee and who's a former educator himself, is on this call right now. I think this time of the year for us is really a time for us to evaluate what's happening on the ground, right? I do school visits. I meet with educators. I talk to some of our education leaders, our school board members here, and both understand the how the policies that we've already put forward are being implemented and what the consequences of those policies are. Educators, I love it, are not shy to share what they're seeing in the classroom, what they're seeing in the school building, and I have found many of those conversations to actually end up dictating the bills that I work on and introduce. I'll actually touch on one that I didn't mention earlier, which is a policy that was actually brought into that Educator Shortage Act that I mentioned earlier, which is a legislation specifically around student debt relief for mental health professionals. Some of these educators, mental health professionals, you think about the amount of student debt that they take on. That is an issue that is we know how that has impacted our generation, Gen Z, just with the rising cost of higher education. So if you have a mental health professional, a school psychologist, for example, that wants to go work in a public school, the incentive just isn't there because if they need to repay student debt, they can repay that far easier if they go work in private practice. So the bill that I introduced, which started as a conversation with mental health professionals, educators in both in our schools and those who were aspiring to work in our schools, we actually, from those conversations, were able to turn legislation or turn those ideas into legislation and eventually into law, providing that targeted student debt relief. So right now, in terms of future issues that we're working on, again, really just spending the next few months understanding where we're at and what needs to get done. But as we look back at what didn't pass this legislative session and the work that is still ahead of us, I really do think there needs to be a focus on our education support professionals, our special educators. Special educators, I believe, still are where we have the largest number of vacancies and the most acute shortage in our state. So I think we have to start looking more strategically in a targeted way at which are those specific areas where we have those vacancies, where we have the shortage more acutely, and how do we start putting forward more targeted approaches to help address those specific shortages?
Thanks so much for sharing those insights. Caroline, we're coming to you with the last question before we head to our Q&A. We wanted to give you the final word as our teacher on the panel to give us a reality check and hear from someone who's still in the classroom doing the work. What policies and approaches do you think would make the biggest difference for you and your colleagues? Either you heard it today or from your own experience. We'd love to hear from you.
So I gotta be honest, I don't know exactly what the solutions would look like, but I do know what the biggest roadblocks for me and teachers my age and friends that I had in college that were in the same prep program as me that, went into a different field. I can speak to what those challenges are, more so that I can speak to how to solve them. I think the biggest thing, it has to be the compensation. We go to school. I went to a small private college and I loved it there, but with private college comes student loans. And then on top of that, my last semester was the student teaching internship where I was working as a music student teacher. I was working over 40 hours a week and I didn't have time for a second job on the side. So I had to take out more loans for that. And I love what Delegate Vogel was talking about with, being able to supplement that for the next generation of teachers. I can't imagine what that would have done for me. But being a young adult in general, I'm looking at my future and I'm looking at trying to buy a house and I'm looking at just getting myself set up for success. This is a 30-year long profession. I don't, in theory, I'm supposed to last that long. And the compensation, I can't afford a house in the county that I teach in. And that's problematic. It keeps teachers out of just general education, and for all of our parapros and our special ed teachers who are not on the same contracts that I'm on, it's their pay is even worse. So we've got to get the compensation up to keep younger teachers engaged and to just keep all of our teachers surviving. I will say, going back to the different preparation programs, there's got to be some consistency across the board. I know my degree is different than what a secondary English teacher education would look like. But that prep program of being for my school, I wasn't put into a classroom to actually try and teach until 3 years into my degree. Part of that was COVID, so not entirely the problem of my university, but I also wasn't scheduled for observation hours until my fourth semester of college, and getting young educators, at least seeing what a classroom could look like, what their classroom could look like, what they don't like. I think that would kind of help people decide before they spend all the money on the education, if they actually want to go into the field or not. And having that consistent expectation. I mean, there's another college 20 minutes down the road from the one that I went to, and the prep programs are entirely different. And I've seen great educators come from both places, and I've seen different educators come from both colleges. But kind of aligning that, the teacher prep program, I don't know what that would look like, but I think that would be very helpful. And then when it comes to a positive culture, I spoke about having mentors and administrators who were not as much helpful as they could have been. And on the mentor side, we've got I'm teaching at the high school that I graduated from, which is amazing. I do love it there. But there are still teachers there that taught me when I was there, and they've been teaching 30 plus years, and they're phenomenal. But they're so phenomenal, they forget what it was like in those first couple of years when they didn't know what was going on. And it's also changed since they first started. I remember sitting in a meeting with my department, and our department chair was one of my teachers, and there was another new teacher who was moving from a different location, and she was asking these questions about the school and the district and all of this stuff. And he couldn't answer the questions because he had been so used to everything for so long. And it's no fault of his own. It's just, you know, there it wasn't like he wasn't trying to be helpful. It's just they forget, and it's because there's no accountability for mentors. They just kind of slap somebody with us and say, there's your mentor, you teach a similar content, so there you go. I also think that there's a whole lot of inconsistent expectations when it comes to younger teachers. I know that those teachers who have been teaching for 30 plus years are they're operating on a different wavelength with different rules than us Gen Z teachers are. And having our administrators hold everybody to the same standard would be helpful. I know that my evaluating administrator was a phenomenal basketball coach for 30 years, and she's a fantastic athletic director. But having her come into my classroom once for 15 minutes and telling me that the knowledge of my content area, which is music, is not up to a specific standard that has been set, I would love for her to show me where I can grow in that area. So I think, having evaluators come in, having consistent expectations that are relevant to our content areas, and more helpful. I Again, I don't know what that would look like. Back to what Lennon was saying, that whole being on an island, you know, I'm the only person that teaches what I teach in my school. Um, I do work on an island, and I'm being told how to do this, how to do that, and in every different way, shape, and form. Um, so I do think that some kind of alignment of what positive culture could look like. I don't know what it would be. I'm sorry, I don't have the right answer, but I do think that a positive work environment that is okay with Gen Z teachers continuing to ask questions and continuing to learn and not being perfect teachers. Um, I think that plus fair compensation is going to solve more problems than should exist already.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights. It was really helpful to hear from someone who's still in the classroom. And next, we are going to head into our Q&A. You can submit questions in the Q&A function. Before we do that, though, I wanted to mention that we are sharing the link to a short survey in the chat. You're welcome to complete it now or at the end of the session. This is the survey that I mentioned at the top. And we'll start off by bringing Shaniqua back in. On the theme of compensation, how do younger teachers' views about compensation, particularly those about benefits, how do they differ from other teachers?
Thank you for that question, Lauren. So, as I noted in my presentation, and as Caroline has also noted, compensation is a huge concern for younger teachers, Gen Z teachers. Although many Gen Z teachers are driven by wanting to pursue a career that is fueled by their passions, many of them know issues like being able to afford a home in their area, being able to provide for a family, being able to pay their bills as major concerns. And so, even if they are so passionate about working with children and having a positive impact, we also know that Gen Z teachers will leave the profession if they do not have compensation that gives them a livable wage. And so that is something particularly exceptional when you think about Gen Z teachers, that passion alone is not enough to keep them in the profession. Salary, benefits, all of those are equally important and drivers for not only recruiting but retaining this generation of teachers.
Thanks so much for sharing that with us. Next up, this question's for anyone on the panel. What state policies are there that need to be revised or put into place that create the conditions to promote, oh, this question's for London, to promote flexible staffing models, but anyone can chime in. What are the barriers for schools and districts to be able to utilize them?
Uh, the National Association of State Boards of Education just released a great news series that addresses just this question, and I have an article in there with Richard Ingersoll that details, some of the things that state boards of education, but of course, right, every state operates differently, and so maybe some of your regulations are legislative, others might be done by the state board, some might just be completely local to your district or your LEA. But I think, there are a couple things that are in that particular NASB piece that are immensely helpful. The National Center for Teacher Quality did a 50 state policy scan that looked at the conditions for implementing a reimagined teaching role or, innovative staffing models. And so I think it's less about particular policies and more about categories of policies. And so examining things like teacher certification. So in some of the states that we work with, that we're lucky enough to work in with school districts, there are kind of two archetypes that have emerged. I'll give this as an example and then give a couple other categories. When you're implementing an innovative staffing model and you're playing with roles and times and space and curriculum in some aspects, some of the certification flexibilities can be very helpful. So, for instance, if you're trying to build middle school team-based staffing models, sometimes the way the schedule lands, you need someone who can just teach one section of social studies. But the reality is, none of those middle school teachers might be certified in social studies. Now, for one period a day where you definitely also have an expert social studies teacher on that team, but you have someone who isn't certified in social studies but could use just one period of flexibility, that's a really interesting example of something that we found that really accelerates staffing models. It's not that we're moving the content expertise entirely to someone else. They're still going to have the support of a mentor. In fact, they're going to share all the same kids all day long. But we find in some of the states that we work in where there is zero flexibility around certification and the courses that a teacher is assigned to, that you can't have those kinds of levels of flexibility. The other pieces, of course, include, which again are quite important, but maybe were built for a different kind of staffing model, which could include teacher-student ratios. We need to look at other things, including, space regulations and like how many students can be in a space and how are we thinking about space within an entire school. And so I would encourage you to check out the NASB, the National Association of State Boards of Education, recent release. But I would also encourage you to take a look at NCTQ, the National Center on Teacher Quality's 50 state scan, to kind of get a sense of where you land as a state in your ability to implement a reimagined teaching role or an innovative staffing model. So that was just one example. Teacher certification, teacher student ratios are a couple things to look at. Master scheduling, the way we think about FTE and how we allocate FTE, all of those things have to change. Those are dominoes that change the minute you change staffing models, mentoring and induction programs, the way we think about assigning mentors, the way we think about teacher prep programs. Those are all dominoes the minute we break out of the one teacher, one classroom model. And so no specific policy, but lots of specific categories.
Thanks so much, Lennon. Um, Next, we'll go to Delegate Vogel. Could you speak more to the Maryland legislation that was passed? Specifically, the question was about debt relief. The asker was interested in knowing if it passed or any details that you could share with us.
Yeah, so that was a bill from a couple years ago. It did pass. It passed eventually as part of the broader Educator Shortage Act. It was amended into it, and yeah, I'm trying to remember all the details of it now, but it is specifically for mental health professionals, so school psychologists, school counselors, school social workers, working in our public schools. There's a number of different, there's some criteria that had to be met, and the amount that they received, I believe it was up to $30,000 in student debt relief. And again, this is one of a number of different measures that we've taken to address the issue of recruitment and the issue of retention of our educators. The other bill that I mentioned earlier that got passed this year that I introduced was around educator workforce housing. Really excited about that. We have as part of the Educator Shortage Act, as I mentioned earlier, um, the um, the scholarships, the financial incentives for student teachers. Um, as part of the blueprint, we set minimum compensations, a minimum compensation of $60,000 for our educators that goes into effect, for our teachers that goes into effect. Um, I believe July 1st of this year was the deadline for that. That might have moved a little bit, but that was the initial date. And then lastly, or again, like sound like a broken record on ESPs, and I see some questions here on compensation and prioritizing compensation. There was legislation this year to set a minimum wage for education support professionals, and we got close to getting that passed, but still have some work to do there.
Thank you to the audience for all your great questions, and thank you to our panel for all your great answers. If you've not yet taken the survey, we're going to drop it again to the chat. And as we close out, we wanted to leave our audience with something concrete. So to each panelist, what's one specific action or policy shift that you would prioritize? And we'll start with Delegate Vogel.
One policy shift.
Yeah, a policy shift or a specific action that you would prioritize next.
Yeah, I want to keep working on this educator housing issue. I know it's been mentioned already on this call, and I'm glad that Caroline brought it up. I always say I think an educator should be able to afford to live in the communities where they teach. And here in Maryland, we have uh, educators that drive 45 minutes an hour at least to get to the classroom, and that's both a recruitment issue and a retention issue, right? And so there's a number of models that we're already seeing here in Maryland, one in Baltimore, where they've been able to develop housing specifically for educators. We met with the folks that worked on that program that now run that model, and then met with experts from across the country to figure out what are some best practices that we can put into policy to incentivize this in our state. I still think, I mean, I would love to see more funding for that, and really a more comprehensive effort to get that done, because the reality is, and I was already looking at the dashboard, the educator compensation dashboard, and again, Maryland has some of the highest teacher pay in the country. But still, for a first year teacher that's making $38,000, you just can't afford to live here. So that I see as a major barrier, and something that I'm going to continue to work on.
Thanks so much, Caroline. And just remind you of the question, just one specific action or policy shift that you would prioritize.
Um, I don't have a super intense knowledge of like what the policy would look like. But a big problem that I see is teachers are not seen as professionals, and even younger teachers are seen as even less professional. I think part of that might just come from a mind shift. But I think, proper compensation and proper preparation programs and proper mentorship and expectations and guidance and consistent expectations and guidance throughout these first couple of years. I would have to say that those are the big three of what needs to change. I don't write the policies. I just do the teaching. But if we want to keep teachers in the classroom, if we want to keep new teachers and young teachers wanting to go into the profession, those are the biggest things that need to be addressed.
Yeah, thank you for those insights. It's invaluable to hear from someone who's in the field currently. And so we appreciate that. Lennon?
One of the things that really strikes me is thinking just about how much of the reports that school districts have to submit to state departments of education or certification requirements are really compliance driven. And this is a little bit of a mindset shift, but it is also more of just a cultural shift in terms of thinking about the policies and how they're written and what they actually incentivize. But, we often talk about not talking about or stopping our conversations about teacher shortage and starting our conversations about workforce design. And so, as I'm thinking about actions that we can take that really might move the needle, as opposed to thinking about this as just something where we're trying to solve a supply side issue or a demand side issue, that we really look at the underlying problem, which we really think is the design of the educator workforce and workplace itself. And so, in particular, in the NASB article that I have written, we have some recommendations for state boards of education, and they definitely also apply as some recommendations for legislators. But I think about reframing our ideas of staffing compliance and checking the boxes to really trying to take a comprehensive systems approach to workforce design. And I don't know what that policy language would look like. I don't even know how that would operationalize, but I think in terms of a mindset shift on behalf of state boards and departments of education and legislators, trying to emphasize design as opposed to compliance is the thing that I would hope people take away.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. And Shaniko, we'll go to you. Can you give us one action or policy shift that you would prioritize?
Yes, I would prioritize based on the research that we've done with early career teachers, early career Gen Zers, and based on my experience as a former special education teacher who went through a very strong quality teacher induction program. That is what I would prioritize. A comprehensive teacher induction program that includes tiered support, quality mentoring, effective leadership. I think with those components, it really can equip new teachers with the skills they need to then increase retention and improve student outcomes. And that is one thing that we have focused on in our blueprint for the educator workforce at SREB is really prioritizing the importance of induction. And induction is not just mentoring. There are different supports that are part of induction programs that really are helpful in sustaining teachers in the educator workforce.
Thank you so much. And everyone, if you could please join me in thanking our speakers. They were incredible. If you haven't yet, and we are just so appreciative of their time and all of their insights. If you haven't yet, we'd appreciate it if you could take those 2 to 3 minutes now to complete the survey before you log off. We really appreciate any feedback you have. It directly informs how we design future webinars. And thank you again to the Wasatch Education Partners for their partnership in developing the survey and helping us take a more thoughtful and data-informed approach to engaging with our audience. As we conclude, please note that registration for our National Forum on Education Policy is July 8th through the 10th in Washington, D.C. Registration is open now, so make sure you secure your spot because we sell out every year. And if you're interested in learning more about these convenings, please contact Caitlin Dennis. We've added her contact information to the chat. In June, please join us for our next webinar, which is focused on school leadership. We got an incredible question about how school leaders impact new teachers right at the end. And we're sorry we couldn't answer it, but we're excited to say that in June we will be talking about the school leader pipeline, and because we know that school leaders are also really important. If you have any questions or requests related to today's session, please feel free to reach out to me. My email's been added to the chat. And as always, today's session was recorded, and it'll be shared in your post-event email. And it'll also be available for viewing on ECS's YouTube page. And with that, thanks everyone and have a great day.